Here with John Dale Grover of the National Interest. He is assistant managing editor. Thought we'd have you come on and talk about Iran for a couple of minutes since there's so much in the news. But let me show you a headline first from the AP of the big news that's coming out as we enter the weekend. U.S. moves to strengthen forces in Middle East to counter Iran. The number they're putting out there is 1,500. When you hear this news, what does that make you think?
It makes me think that we're over-inflating the danger that Iran is posing to us, especially when you consider that for the longest time they continue to comply with the Iran deal. Now, that's changed recently a bit, and I think that we ought to be concerned about that, but I think that's more due to the ongoing tensions than it is to a deliberate nefarious nature on their part to completely upend the entire thing.
Are there dangers to the U.S. and that part of the world from Iran right now? I mean, the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor say there are. What do you say?
I think that there are, but I think we need to be realistic about how big those threats are. So it's one thing to say Iran has proxies, they use them against us. We have to worry about the threat to our service members, to U.S. civilians. But it's another thing to say that they're so dangerous we need to think about a war. They're not Russia and China. They don't have nuclear weapons. This kind of threat inflation is not helpful.
So with all that is the headline to your piece and the National Interest, John Dale Grover. America must not stumble into a third Gulf War. What are you saying here?
I'm saying that we need to think about crisis management and we need to be realistic about the threat. Again, we should be thinking about great power competition. That's what the Trump administration laid out in their own national security strategy. We need to be thinking about shifting away from this. Trump was elected on, not continuing all of these long wars that he inherited from Bush and that he inherited from Obama. It's not in his interest to start another one, and it's not in the interest of the American people either.
Let's put the phone numbers up on the bottom of the screen for our guest, John Dale Grover. We'll take calls from Democrats, 202-748-8000, Republicans, 748-8001, Independents, 202-747-8002, and active and retired military. We'll put a number up for you folks too. It's 202-748-8003. We look forward to getting to your calls for our guest, John Dale Grover, who is assistant managing editor for the National Interest. Exactly what is the National Interest?
The Center for the National Interest is a think tank in Washington, D.C. We talk about realism. We talk about what is in the national interest. We have a robust debate on our website and in our research about what is the best thing to pursue for us and what realism means. So we feature people from all over the political spectrum as well.
A little bit from your piece. Although Tehran, you write about Iran. Tehran is an enemy. There is no immediate danger other than the threat inflation hawks from Washington, as you've touched on. Moreover, a preemptive war would be an overreaction that would cost American lives, money, and bandwidth when deterring China, North Korea, and Russia is more important. You spoke about the management of this latest chapter in the conflict. What is proper management on the U.S. part as you see it?
So part of that's communication. You have to communicate to the other people. One of the things that made Reagan so brilliant is that he tied peace through strength, deterrence, with communication. We were willing to deter the Soviets, but we were also willing to hash out agreements with them. And that's how I look at the now discarded, at least on our part, the Iran deal on both parts. But essentially, we had this thing, it took 2 years to work out, but it stopped them from getting the nuclear weapon, which was our objective. And I think that that is the thing that matters the most, is if we can stop them from doing that. And right now, we'll keep pushing each other, and it's a dangerous situation.
What do you make of the leadership in Iran, and are they willing to communicate?
I think they are. Rouhani was elected in part on the promise of, hey, we're going to talk to the Americans, we're going to try to work something out, maybe we can find some common ground, even though we've been these hostile mutual enemies. But our withdrawal from the Iran deal, and now Iran's partial withdrawal as well, is creating a situation where hardliners in our administration, hardliners in Tehran's administration is saying, we got to go. And it's not in either side's interest to push things towards a crisis.
One more question before we get to calls. Was the Iranian nuclear deal a good deal?
On net, I would say yes, if you consider the primary objective was to stop them creating a nuclear weapon. If you can talk about a bunch of other things, missile testing, them using proxies in the region, no, but that's why you want to build upon things and reform them rather than blowing them up. They're a threat. We should treat them as a threat and deter them, but we also should understand we can talk to them and try to find a way to manage it just like we did with the Soviets.
Let's get to those calls now. Kelly, Garden Grove, California, independent caller for John Dale Grover. Good morning.
Good morning, John. Thank you for your commentary on here. And I just want to say that I think this is just another diversion tactic of Trump being backed into a corner, for one. Number two, I think that it's the war hawks of John Bolton and the true troika of terror, who is Mike Pence, John Bolton, and Mike Pompeo, trying to drum up another skirmish to get us into an international catastrophe and maybe kick off World War III.
And Kelly, why would they want to do that, do you think?
You know, I think that, one, they want to line their pockets from the industrialized war complex, and I think that they really don't care. I don't think that there's any blood on their hands. They can send it out, and this is how they act.
Kelly, one more question. We know the president has said, at least publicly, he doesn't want a conflict with Iran. You're talking about some of the folks around him. What do you make of that dynamic within the White House?
We all can trust what Trump says because he's so honest, isn't he?
That was Kelly. Your thoughts?
I would certainly not say that Trump's advisors are pushing for a third world war or anything like that. If we're going to talk about different world views and how much they think Iran is so much of a threat that we should even consider a third Gulf War, absolutely. They come at it with a very different mindset, Bolton in particular, thinking, hey, you know, the only way we're ever going to have peace is if we have regime change. But as we've seen with Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and on, that gets very messy very quick. Stephen
from Morrisville, North Carolina. Good morning to you, Stephen. You're on the independent line as well.
Hi, good morning. In regards to Iran and their pursuit of nuclear weapons or nuclear power in some way, what are they saying that they are going after in terms of nuclear technology, and why should we not be concerned about a country as roguish as Iran having that kind of technology?
It's a good question. I would say we should be concerned about them pursuing that technology. We definitely wouldn't want them to have it, which was the purpose of the Iran deal. Currently, what they've done is they've said we are going to partially withdraw by enriching more uranium than they're currently allowed to, but not up to weapons grade. So if you think about it from the context of Iranian domestic politics, the president's in a tough place. He needs to be tough, just like any president does, but he also doesn't want to face off against the most powerful country on earth. So he needs to find a way to say, hey, I'm going to, kind of withdraw from the deal, but he doesn't want to go too far. So I think that Iran's president is hoping for a diplomatic solution to this.
Do other countries, or should other countries in that region have a role in this potential conflict with the U.S. and Iran? What should they be doing or saying right now?
Well, I would like to think that most of them, of course, we don't live in an ideal world, would want to find some kind of peaceful solution to this. Again, it depends on the country that we're talking about. If we're talking about Saudi Arabia, we're talking about Israel, that are traditional rivals of Iran, they certainly would be okay with a more military solution. But either way, we need to work with our allies to deter and to make sure that Iran doesn't do anything with its proxies. But again, I would separate the two. You want to deter some things, but you also want to talk on other things.
Let me run this headline by you. It's in the New York Times and elsewhere. Trump circumvents Congress to sell weapons to Middle East allies. They're writing here that the president declared an emergency over Iran yesterday and is moving forward with arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan. These are sales that have been blocked by Congress last year. Lots of criticism from lawmakers, but what do you think?
I don't think that we should be selling those weapons to those countries. I mean, especially if you look at the crisis in Yemen, we have a lot of people that have died, and you have, it's frankly a crisis that's on the scale of Syria, worse even. And I don't think that morally and even in our national interest is a reason for us to be supporting this conflict. Now, there are allies. It doesn't mean that we can't sell them some things, we can't work with them. But again, you have to think about what are our objectives here, and we shouldn't be fighting Saudi Arabia's war for them.
To our line for military, active, then retired. It's Rudolph from Daytona Beach. Good morning to you.
Good morning. I would like to talk for a moment about our divided country.
Okay.
And I was drafted in 1960 and sent to Germany. And we had this long barracks in Frankfurt, Germany. And it was it was the Mason-Dixon line. We had the Northerners and California on one end, and we had the Southerners on the other. And we did not mingle. We just had nothing in common. And we get a weekend pass. The Southerners would stay in the barracks and buy cheap American beer and get drunk. And we went out. The Northerners would go out in town. Sorry, you Southerners, but that's the way it was. And they're divided, and still divided today.
Question for our guest while we have him here.
German beer at the PX, but no, they chose cheap American beer.
Thanks for calling, Rudolph. Anything you want to respond to there?
Just that there are organizations working on the bipartisan and geographic divide. StoryCorps, for instance, is looking at bringing people into a booth to talk about their stories and how they can talk to people over different political beliefs. All Sides displays news from different points of view. Living Room Conversations tries to help people to have these difficult conversations about social issues. So there's people working on this issue.
Talking recently with Russia and China. What do you see there? Any concerns in any areas?
My concern is that we go back to fire and fury. We go back to a situation in which each side is exchanging threats, verbal threats, having heightened military activity, engaging in the kinds of escalatory behavior where it becomes very personal and very much a tit for tat, and we worry about that spiraling out of control. That's why I think it's important that both sides should have liaison offices at the very least set up. You need to have an open channel of communication. Again, we learned that in the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? That's why we got the hotline. And I also think that's why you need to find ways to have some confidence building. It doesn't mean you think that they're wonderful. Kim Jong-un is dangerous, but that does mean that you talk to them and you have some joint things that go forward, such as searching for military remains after the Korean War.
What do you make of the breakup of that last summit? And should there be another summit, what purpose would it serve?
If there was another summit, I think that certainly the purpose should be to restart negotiations. The catch is whether or not each side's willing to give anything. We're asking for everything up front. That's a non-starter for North Korea. North Korea wants a lot of sanctions relief. That's a non-starter to us. We need to find some kind of step-by-step freeze for freeze, I think, is the best way forward. And essentially that would be that. But what I would say about the way Hanoi blew up is that if we engaged in it if we talked to North Korea and said, hey, we'll give a little bit here, that's what it looked like might have happened. But in the last minute, Pompeo intervened, and it looked like that didn't work out. But both sides left the door open to future diplomacy. So that's the thing to emphasize, is that they almost had a deal. We need to have step-by-step, and both sides left the door open. And that's the key thing. We're not going back to fire and fury yet, but we need to make sure we don't.
Let's get back to calls. It's Bernard in Wisconsin on our line for active and retired military. Good morning, Bernard.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for C-SPAN. I
welcome.
watch you every morning. I'm a retired Chief Petty Officer. I was with Carrier Group 1 on USS Constellation in 1980 when we tried to rescue the hostages. And I have a couple of comments. One, if the Iran deal was such a good deal, the President negotiates a treaty, the Senate ratifies it. President Obama did not submit it to the Senate, so therefore it's the next president can do what he wants. I'd like you to comment on that. And second, on the aborted mission, I saw it on the teletype where President Carter ordered the abort. And ever since then, we've been running scared from Iran.
Caller, what were those times like for you?
Oh, it was just a job.
Anything beyond that you want to tell us?
I just can't comment on what was going on. But I was there, and I think we should have went in and rescued the hostages instead of running scared.
Okay, a little bit of historical perspective there from someone who was there. Any response?
I would say that Obama certainly should have given the treaty to the Senate to ratify. That would have been the correct constitutional thing to do. I also think that Republicans in Congress shouldn't have been so skeptical about trying to build something. We've had armed agreements with the Soviets. We've talked to other people. We've coexisted with the Chinese now for a while. Even though they have nuclear weapons, it is possible to work out something slowly over time. The Iran deal took 2 years to put together. It's very hard to overcome mistrust. So I'd say that absolutely should have submitted it to the Senate. At the same time, I understand the idea that wanting to go in to get those hostages, I think that makes sense too. Frankly, we were too weak under Carter, and we had that corrective under Reagan.
Let's hear from Rachel. Rachel's in Memphis, Tennessee. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I just wanted to comment on our actions in the Middle East. We are allies with Saudi Arabia, who is the chief funder of the Salafi Wahhabi extremist form of terrorist groups, and we give them unbelievable amount of weapons. And then we're also allies with Israel, who has committed more espionage against the United States, including stealing nuclear secrets in our nuclear technology. Yet Iran, who we overthrew their government in 1953 and installed a horrific dictator and we have sanctioned them, stolen their money, and crippled them economically, which I find economic sanctions to be war. That is economic terrorism. So I'm really, really offended, and I find it outrageous that we're even contemplating starting a war with Iran, who should not be under so much pressure by us just for wanting to have an independent foreign policy and determine their own destiny.
So, Rachel, what should the more precise U.S. foreign policy be then toward Iran?
Well, it should be, number one, to pursue diplomacy and work with them and not sanction them to bring them or to bring them into submission. That should be number one. That's common decency between states. It should be. We should not act like we are superior, and we should rethink, why are we allies with Saudi Arabia, who, Hillary Clinton and other officials have overtly admitted that they are the chief funders of Al-Qaeda and ISIS groups. And we give them how much in weaponry? We sell them how much in weapons? So I find this very, very, this contradiction in our policy. And I don't know if our officials think that the public is too ignorant to figure this out. But, here in flyover country, we know exactly what's going on.
Rachel, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Let's hear from our guest.
I would certainly say we definitely have made a devil's bargain with a lot of our allies for the sake of maintaining influence in oil supplies post-World War II, especially with the Saudis. I think that it's definitely past time to have some kind of a reckoning, a kind of rethink about our alliances in the Middle East. The question is whether we're finally going to get there, because support for Saudi Arabia and other countries has had a bipartisan consensus by both parties since World War II, since the end of World War II.
The administration's supposed to be releasing soon a Middle East plan, a revised plan for the Middle East. What are you anticipating?
I'm anticipating that to include an attempt at some kind of a peace deal. Frankly, I'm not exactly hopeful for that. We'll see how that goes. I think it's always good to try those sort of things, but a lot of the behaviors that we've engaged in and some of the people that we support isn't especially conducive to that. We'll see what that looks like.
Meant to ask you more about China too and the recent trade tensions. While they could be resolved, but do you see those trade tensions leading to other larger problems in other areas of the U.S.-China relationship?
Potentially. So on one hand, speaking for myself, observing China for a long time, really nervous about finally pushing back because we've had so many years of intellectual property theft. So now that we're finally pushing back, a lot of people who watch China, like myself, are like, oh, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe we're finally starting to push back a bit. It's about time. Granted, there's an upper limit to that. We have to worry about if it gets to a point to where national pride gets at stake, and let's say, God forbid, there's some kind of accidental clash in the South China Sea. You don't want tensions to get so bad as a result of the trade war that you find yourself facing a possibility of an actual armed conflict. So the question is, how do you push back but don't go too far?
Let's hear from Jacob. Jacob is in Memphis, Michigan. Is it Michigan? Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Good morning. How's it going?
Go ahead. We're doing well. Go ahead, Jacob.
I have some curiosities about Israel in regards to the Iran conflict. What role do you think that Israel is going to play in this? And do you think that they will push more aggressions towards Syria due to the fact that the United States is their ally, and Syria and Iran are essentially allies at this point?
Thank you, Jacob.
So I would say that Israel definitely has an interest in making sure that Iran does not pursue nuclear weapons. They used assassinations, bombings to kill a lot of Iranian scientists before. But part of that's also just that rivalry. So they want to make sure that they can push back in multiple ways. So you can assume, of course, Israel will take a very hard line on Iran. In Syria, too, they want to make sure that Iran's proxies or anyone else who has influence there isn't doing anything that could jeopardize Israeli security. And Israel is very, very sensitive to that. The Middle East is very much a realist, hard, dog-eat-dog place, and everyone has to be, everyone is very sensitive to anything that rivals are doing.
Down to our last couple of moments here. Joel from Chicopee, Massachusetts, Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning. I want to comment. I'm particularly concerned about the news in the last couple of days about the Trump administration bypassing Congress. to send arms to Saudi Arabia. And with all of the things that we know about the Trump family, Jared Kushner, and their relationship with MBS, it raises a ton of concerns about the way they're approaching foreign policy, particularly with concerns now with this news about Iran. So I wanted to get your take on that and see what your thoughts are.
Touched on it a little bit, but do you want to add more?
I'll just add that it's important that we maintain checks and balances regardless of which party, which person is in office, to make sure that we are conducting foreign policy that's in the interest of the American people in general, and that we are doing things with proper oversight.
Let's hear from Grace. I think Grace will be the final call here. Quincy, Massachusetts, independent. Hey there.
Hi, I agree with the woman. I was going to bring up the same things that she did, the history of Iran, how we put in the Shah of Iran and how he brutalized his own people. But I also feel you got to look at 9/11. That came from Saudi Arabian nationalists. And then I also look at the fact that many countries came up with the plan for nuclear weapons. And so when you have something in place, you don't destroy it. You build on it. And we don't do that. I look at what's happening. We're selling guns to Saudi Arabia. So we get oil and all this craziness. And what's happening to those children in Yemen? My heart is bleeding. I don't know what's happening to my country. And I think I look at Congress and they don't work together. And this is not the country I remember. I'm 85 years old, and I'm very, very sad. I think you have to work together for peace and not for war. And in the Middle East, it's like a time bomb there. From what I understand about Jared Kushner, his plan is to give the Palestinians business deals. The Palestinians don't want that. They want their independence. So I think we got a long way to go, and I thank this young man for speaking out, because I don't think all Americans are listening. And that is my hope, that somehow we won't have a war, that we won't be sending young people in to die. We went into Iraq under the wrong principles as well. So we have to rethink our political history. And
Understood. Understood, Grace. Thank you. You had the final word there for this segment from Massachusetts. Let's hear one final thought from our guest.
Well, thank you so much for the comments, everyone. I really appreciate it. And certainly, I would say that the Middle East has diminished in importance, and that's a psychological reckoning that a lot of people in Washington hasn't had. The United States is a net exporter of oil. We should be worried about the big fish, not the small fish. It's about Russia, China, North Korea, not about non-nuclear countries. And we need to make that shift and rethink our alliance structures and where we're focusing our resources on.
Our guest has been John Dale Grover, Assistant Managing Editor at the National Interest. Nationalinterest.org is the place to go to read more. Thanks a lot for your time and your opinion on things this morning.
Thank you for having me.